Using Django's shell, we'll see how we can manipulate data and interact with models. So we'll begin interacting with models first with Django shell, and we'll see later on how we can interact with models in other ways. And I can use direct SQL syntax by opening up the database file and running commands, but Django provides some nice abstraction layers on top of it so that I don't actually need to execute these commands myself. I can begin to work more generally with Python classes and variables and things that I've used inside of the Python language. So I can enter Django's shell where I can just run Python commands. And so I can enter Django's shell by running the command python manage.py shell, so that I can begin to write Python commands to get executed on this web application. So I'm going to type in python manage.py shell and click on enter, and as I write this command, I am in Python shell. And so the first thing I'd like to do is from flights dot models. So flights is the name of my application, and I want to get from the models.py file. I'm going to import that model, which is called flight, and I'm going to click on enter. And now, as I said, I'm importing the flight class from the models flight that I've just created. Now what I can do is that I can create a new flight. I can say something like f equal a flight, let's say, whose origin is, so let's write first flight, which is the name of the model, and whose origin is, let's say, New York, and let's give it also a destination, and let's say the destination is London, and the duration of this flight is going to be, let's say, 415 minutes. So 415, and you can see that we did not add 415 inside of a string because we specified that the duration is going to be an integer field. And now I can hit enter and then save it, after save, in order to add it to my database. If I don't click after save, then this flight won't be added to my database. And so, as I said, this syntax is my way of inserting data to the table. And then now I just have to add a Python command, and Django knows that when I create a new flight and save it, that it should run an instant command on the underlying SQL tables, where here I've created a new flight with this particular origin and destination and duration, and I'm gonna head and save that flight as well. If I want to compile that flight, maybe get information from that flight, I can say something like flight.objects.all, for example, and that is going to give me it's equivalent to saying first select all in SQL, as in give me all the flights that are inside of my system or my database. And so you can see here that Python shell gave me an error saying that flight is not defined, and this is actually because we added flight with a lower case and not a higher case, and so it has to be an uppercase. So let's fix it. So flight.objects.all, and now let's go ahead and click enter, and you can see that we are returned with with a query set that has a flight object, and which has and so this is the flight class, and this is flight object 1, and we have one flight that came back from flight object 1. So a flight have been created for me with the ID 1. So 1 stands for the ID that we've talked about in the previous video, that is created by default. Now flight object 1 probably not at all helpful of a name. It'd be nicer if this model had a cleaner way of saying the name of a particular flight, for example, and it turns out that we can do that. Any model, I'll go back to the code inside of models.py, which is right here, and any model can implement double_str function. So I'm going to begin by writing that function, and self is the argument, and so self is the flight itself, the flight object itself, and so this is a string representation for that flight object. That doesn't apply to Django objects only, but Python classes generally. That this Python class is going to return a string object of that class whenever we try to print it. And so here we'll be returning a formatted string, which is going to be including that self, that object.id, and let's say followed by self.origin, so ID, then origin, and origin of course needs a destination, so self.origin to self.destination, and this is a formatted string, so everything is going to be inside of curly bracelets in order to replace that variable inside of our string. And so that's about it. And so here what I said is that this string representation of any flight is going to be a string that gives its ID and then says origin to destination. Just a nice clean name that is going to represent this particular flight object. And so just for you who don't know what is a format string, so whenever you want to place a variable inside of a string, you first begin by writing f, that stands for formatted, and followed by the variables inside of my string, just inside of curly brackets. So here, for example, self.id is a variable where I've put it inside of curly bracelets, and of course the string begins by f as in formatted. So now if I go back to my Python shell, and let's say and type in exit to rerun our shell, so yes, and we re-enter Python manage.py shell, and now I first need to again say from flights.import models, I'm going to be importing flight, which is our flight class, and so enter. And now what I'd like to say is let's let a variable called flights to be equal to flights.objects.all. So flights equals to flight.objects.all. And now I'd like to visualize that flights variable, so I'm going to type in flights and hit enter. And so now what I see is that this is a much nicer way of representing the string representation of the name, which makes it a little bit easier to interact with it. So we have this query set which has one flight with ID 1 from New York to London, As I said, now it's much easier. It makes it a little bit nicer to interact with it. And if I just wanted to get this one flight, I can say something like flights dot first. So flights equals to flight, so flights dot first. And so now, so let's just remove s, so this is a new variable just to see it. So now I created a new variable which is flights dot first, and so let's go ahead and see that variable. And so flights is a query set which has one flight. However, this is one flight object, so one object, not a set of flights with ID 1 from New York to London. And so now I have this flight, as I said, from New York to London. As in any Python object, I can begin to access these properties of that object by saying, let's say, flight, what is your ID? Or flight, what is your origin? Or what is your destination? And endly, what is your duration? I can access all these variables of this flight that I ultimately care about by just typing simple code. So let's say I want to get the ID, so I just type in flight dot ID, and so the ID is 1. Flight dot duration, it's 415. Flight dot origin, it's New York, and that's inside of a string. Flight dot destination, and it's London. And I can say something like delete that flight, so I can just write in flight dot delete. And so now I've deleted this flight. So if I go ahead and re-enter that flights query set that I've had, you can see that now my query set is empty, because originally it only had that flight that I just deleted. So now this flights variable query set is empty. So this is how we can create let's say module or model objects inside of Python shell, or let's say Django's shell.